The breakdown did not start with a dramatic storm or a natural disaster. It began with something far simpler. Buyers disappeared. Farmers across the Midwest finished their harvests, expecting the usual shipment deadlines, contract calls, and trucking schedules. Instead, they found inboxes empty and silos filling faster than they could react. The collapse in demand has become unmistakable. Soybean contracts that once formed the backbone of the export economy have vanished, and corn shipments that traditionally moved like clockwork have stalled. Lately, the numbers are not just disappointing, they are alarming. Soybean exports from the United States have fallen by more than 3 trum so far this year, and China, once the most reliable customer, has shifted nearly all new purchasing to Brazil and Argentina, increasing its Brazilian imports by more than 3 tram. Meanwhile, wheat exports have reached their lowest level in over 3 a sign of how deeply the market has rerouted itself. This shift is not simply about lost sales, it marks a loss of relevance. When a nation like China stops placing even a single new order in a calendar year, that is not hesitation, it is a verdict, and other buyers are following the same pattern. The Philippines has reduced its wheat purchases from the United States by 1 trum, labeling American supply too unpredictable. Hankook, traditionally a stable partner, has sharply rebalanced its imports as well, cutting U.S. market share to below 1 trum, while increasing Canadian wheat purchases by 1 trum. These shifts are not temporary bargaining maneuvers. They are long-term recalculations built around stability, timing, and political risk. For American farmers, the impact is immediate and brutal. Contracts that disappeared in days took decades to build. Buyers who once depended on the United States have quietly replaced it in their procurement plans, with suppliers offering fewer surprises and more consistency. The consequence is an agricultural sector confronting a crisis far larger than a single bad season. This is the start of a systemic dislocation, a moment when the world signals that the United States is no longer the default choice for grain. For families who rely on the land, the message is clear. The market they once fed has moved on, and it is not waiting for them to catch up. The crisis did not emerge out of thin air. It was engineered through policies that promised protection but delivered pain. When the United States imposed sweeping tariffs on key imports, the intention was to shield American industries. In practice, it created a cost spiral that farmers had no way to outrun. Fertilizer, replacement parts, steel for grain bins, and even basic machinery components all surged in price overnight. Input costs for many farms have risen by 1 tram since the tariff expansions, hitting small and mid-size operations the hardest. Farmers who once balanced tight margins now face a simple equation: every acre planted costs more, and every bushel sold earns less. The damage is not limited to materials. Farm income across the country is projected to fall by 1 trum this year, erasing years of incremental recovery. At the same time, farm debt has climbed by 1 tram, driven by operating loans that no longer match the revenue coming in. Even those who tightened budgets, postponed equipment upgrades, or cut labor expenses found that none of it mattered once export markets began collapsing. They were promised a stronger bargaining position on the global stage. Instead, they were handed higher bills and fewer customers. Tariffs were sold as a strategy to support the people who feed the country. But farmers quickly discovered that the policy's real impact hit them harder than anyone else. They paid more for everything they needed to grow a crop, while watching the markets they relied on evaporate. Bankruptcy indicators are rising, with farm delinquency rates now approaching 1 trum, the highest in over a decade, a sign that even conservative operations are straining under the weight of decisions made far from their fields. In political speeches, this situation is framed as patriotic sacrifice. In rural America, it is simply called survival mode. When export demand collapses, the shock doesn't stop at the farm gate. It travels through the entire system, jamming every link in the supply chain that once kept American agriculture moving. Grain elevators that normally cycle inventory every few weeks are now packed past capacity. Farmers who used to ship directly after harvest are calling every storage site within driving distance, only to hear the same answer: no room left. National logistics reports now show that outbound agricultural rail traffic has fallen sharply, and the number of cancelled or blank sailings from major West Coast ports has increased by 1 trum. For every train that doesn't run and every ship that doesn't leave port, someone in the countryside loses another chance to move a product that is already losing value. The congestion hasn't come cheap. With contracts gone and grain piles swelling, warehouse rental rates have jumped from bar muid and nummuid von trum across multiple Midwest regions, adding yet another line item to budgets already stretched thin. Some operators have resorted to leaving crops in open piles, risking spoilage simply because there's nowhere left to store them. Trucks sit idle, not because there's no grain to move, but because there's no buyer waiting at the other end. The supply chain that once acted like a finely tuned machine now resembles a long stretch of stalled traffic, each mile representing another bottleneck created by disappearing global demand. This slowdown radiates outward. Processing plants reduce shifts. Port workers see hours cut. Maintenance crews from local rail yards are told to stay home because nothing is moving. Even industries that feel far from farming fabricators, construction crews, rural trucking company feel the tremors as their customers delay or cancel work. The collapse isn't contained within farms, it spreads through every community tied to agriculture, which in much of the United States means entire counties. What was once described as an export problem has become a system-wide paralysis, exposing just how dependent the broader economy is on the steady, predictable flow of American crops. And right now, nothing about that flow is steady or predictable. Behind the numbers is a human crisis unfolding in slow motion. Farmers who once measured their lives by planting seasons and harvest cycles now measure them by loan deadlines and overdue notices. The financial pressure is relentless. Farm debt delinquencies have climbed to Hern Bafimort von Trem, the highest level in more than 10 years, and every percentage point represents thousands of families pushed closer to losing land they've held for generations. Many have poured everything they own into a crop they cannot sell, hoping the market will turn before the bank does. Others are making impossible choice whether to refinance a loan they know they can't repay or walk away from a business their grandparents built. This strain reaches far beyond spreadsheets. Rural mental health centers report rising distress calls, and requests for financial counseling and crisis assistance are up significantly across the Farm Belt, reflecting a level of anxiety that many community leaders say they have never seen before. The stigma around asking for help is fading only because the alternative is worse. At co-op meetings that used to be filled with practical talk about seed varieties and equipment upgrades, the conversations now center on survival: how long a family can afford to hold on, whether it makes sense to plant at all. What happens if another export season collapses? One story is echoed in countless towns. A farmer stands up during a meeting, voice shaking, and admits he may have to sell the farm before his grandson graduates high school. No one laughs, no one whispers. They all recognize the same fear in themselves. With farm incomes expected to drop by nearly high mui by von Trum this year, that fear is not irrational arts arithmetic. The collapse of export markets has turned a proud profession into a gamble, where the odds get worse every month, and the cost of losing is everything a family has ever worked for. In rural America, hope has always been the last thing to go. But right now, even hope feels like it's running short. Political pressure was inevitable. When markets collapse and bills pile up, farmers don't just stay quiet, they demand accountability. Across the Farm Belt, frustration has shifted from private anger to public action. Groups of producers who once avoided politics altogether now gather outside county courthouses with signs warning that their livelihoods are being bargained away. They're not wrong to feel that way. 12 states have taken the unusual step of challenging the federal government in court, arguing that the administration's sweeping tariff powers have damaged rural economies far beyond anything lawmakers intended. In Washington, this fight has triggered a broader debate over whether a single branch of government should be able to rewrite global trade relationships with the stroke of a pen. New proposals circulating in Congress aim to rein in those powers. Some lawmakers want any major tariff action to require legislative approval, a safeguard meant to prevent exactly the kind of economic whiplash that American agriculture is living through. Their argument is simple. If rural communities are being asked to absorb the fallout, then their representatives should have a say before those shocks are unleashed. Meanwhile, the data coming in from across the country strengthens their case. Rural lenders are reporting tighter credit conditions, and early signs of loan contraction are appearing in heavily agricultural counties, suggesting that the financial system itself is losing confidence in the stability of farm income. Yet federal officials continue to pitch new trade deals with far-off nations as signs of progress agreements that might look good in press releases but do little to replace the massive, long-term contracts lost in Asia and North America. Farmers see through the disconnect immediately. They know the math. Small markets don't offset big losses. Diplomacy doesn't fix broken supply chains. And political victory laps don't change the fact that export volumes for key crops have dropped sharply while major buyers shift permanently to competitors. The contrast is stark. In Washington, this is framed as strategic positioning. In America's heartland, it feels like managed decline. The people who grow the country's food are left wondering how much more strategy their communities can survive. The consequences of this collapse do not stop in the countryside. When thousands of tractors sit idle and export channels dry up, every American, whether living on a farm or in a downtown apartment, feels the impact. Food prices are already rising as domestic supply chains absorb the shock of reduced production. Grocery stores that once depended on steady flows of grain, feed, and livestock inputs now face shortages that ripple through meat, dairy, and processed foods. Analysts warn that the United States may need to import as much as 3 trillion bushels of wheat to stabilize domestic supply, an unprecedented reversal for a country that once called itself the world's breadbasket. Import dependence is not just an economic shift, it is a vulnerability that Americans have not had to confront in generations. At the same time, global competitors are expanding into the spaces the United States has left vacant. Canada has increased its agricultural exports to the European Union by Trum, strengthening ties with buyers who once relied heavily on American products. Brazil and Argentina, now entrenched in Asia's supply chains, are positioning themselves as long-term anchors in markets where the United States used to hold unquestioned influence. These moves reshape the global food landscape, and they reduce America's leverage in ways that won't be fixed by a change of policy or another round of trade negotiations. What emerges is a national reckoning. If American farmers cannot survive under current conditions, the entire country's food security, pricing stability, and economic foundation come into question. This is not a rural problem, it is a national one. And it forces a blunt question: what happens when the people who feed the nation feel abandoned by the very system they support? Washington can frame this as strategy, adjustment, or necessary toughness. But families watching their farms slip away have a different view. They see a country willing to risk its food future on political theater. Whether America chooses to correct course or continues down a path where others grow the food we depend on will determine far more than export numbers. It will determine what kind of nation we become. The consequences of this collapse do not stop in the countryside. When thousands of tractors sit idle and export channels dry up, every American, whether living on a farm or in a downtown apartment, feels the impact. Food prices are already rising as domestic supply chains absorb the shock of reduced production. Grocery stores that once depended on steady flows of grain, feed, and livestock inputs now face shortages that ripple through meat, dairy, and processed foods. Analysts warn that the United States may need to import as much as 3 trillion bushels of wheat to stabilize domestic supply, an unprecedented reversal for a country that once called itself the world's breadbasket. Import dependence is not just an economic shift, it is a vulnerability that Americans have not had to confront in generations. At the same time, global competitors are expanding into the spaces the United States has left vacant. Canada has increased its agricultural exports to the European Union by Trum, strengthening ties with buyers who once relied heavily on American products. Brazil and Argentina, now entrenched in Asia's supply chains, are positioning themselves as long-term anchors in markets where the United States used to hold unquestioned influence. These moves reshape the global food landscape, and they reduce America's leverage in ways that won't be fixed by a change of policy or another round of trade negotiations. What emerges is a national reckoning. If American farmers cannot survive under current conditions, the entire country's food security, pricing stability, and economic foundation come into question. This is not a rural problem, it is a national one. And it forces a blunt question. What happens when the people who feed the nation feel abandoned by the very system they support? Washington can frame this as strategy, adjustment, or necessary toughness. But families watching their farms slip away have a different view. They see a country willing to risk its food future on political theater. Whether America chooses to correct course or continues down a path where others grow the food we depend on will determine far more than export numbers. It will determine what kind of nation we become. Thank you for watching. What do you think about this situation, and how should America respond? Share your thoughts in the comments below.